We left off last week in 2 Samuel 13. We left off with verse 20. We'll pick up there in just a few moments. So turn there to 2 Samuel 13. Let me give you just a brief recap thus far in 2 Samuel 13. David has many wives. Too many. You see here is the chart of his wives. You see the question marks because he also had concubines and many children by his wives. We're dealing right now in 2 Samuel 13 with the family portion that is in this box right here. David's firstborn sons, his name is Amnon. Amnon is the child of David by Ahinoam. Ahinoam was the Jezreelitess. She would be his second wife. So his firstborn son by his second wife, because Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children. Then we also are dealing with two other of David's children, Absalom and Tamar, who are descendant from David through Maacah, who is the daughter of Talmai, who is the king of Geshur. And that's going to matter a little bit as we move forward this evening. Amnon, at the beginning of the chapter, he took notice of his half-sister Tamar. Again, they have the same father, different mothers. He takes notice of her, begins to lust after her. He knew that this was an illicit desire that could not be justifiably fulfilled. His lust took him so far that Amnon made himself sick out of desire for his sister Tamar. He was at a loss. He didn't know what to do. He was sick in his lustful state. And again, I know it's kind of icky, the whole situation is, but again, this is where sin takes you. Amnon, he's sick for his sister, but in verse 3 we read, "But Amnon had a friend." This friend's name was Jonadab. You need to know that name for later too. Jonadab was David's nephew, so he is Amnon's cousin. He's also Absalom's cousin. Jonadab came and proposed a plan whereby Amnon could fulfill his lust for his sister. And Amnon follows the plot that was hatched by Jonadab. He asks David, the king, to send Tamar to nurse him back to health. He says, I'm terribly sick. Could you send Tamar to help me? Unsuspectingly, David sends Tamar to Amnon's house. And in spite of her pleading and reasoning, Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. Immediately, just like that, like a switch is flipped, his lust is changed to hatred. And Tamar leaves his presence in public mourning. Now, this is significant. Again, you remember, she was wearing a coat of many colors. And a coat of many colors is a sign of favor. And it's also, many times in this day, it was a sign that you are part of a privileged class. In her case, all of the virgin daughters of the king wore this particular cut of cloth. And so when she leaves, she tears her garment, her coat of many colors. She puts dust on her head and she goes out weeping, indicating that something terrible had happened. When the coat that is the sign of your being a part of this particular group is torn, that indicates that you are no longer in that group, as in fact Tamar was no more in this group. Absalom sees Tamar in this state. And it's interesting, if you look, we'll read verse 20. He immediately puts his finger on what's going on, almost like he knew what had happened beforehand. Look at verse 20. And Absalom, her brother, said unto her, Hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? Well, it could have been anything. But David puts his finger right on exactly what happened. Hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister. He is thy brother. Regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Sadly enough, we don't know a whole lot more about what happened to Tamar. She lived in Absalom's house, but we're going to see Absalom's house is thrown into chaos in the coming chapters, as you well know. Tonight we're going to look at David's response. We ran out of time last week, so we're going to look at David's response. This is, to put it mildly, in a dramatic understatement, David's family is a mess. Okay? He's got children who are raping other children. It's a mess. But it comes to David, and we see his response in verse 21. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very wroth. And that's what we've got. That's David's response. The word wroth is interesting. It means to glow. It means to flare up. It means to be grieved or incensed. So David's anger is explosive, but it's also very quick. You've heard the expression, that such and such is a flash in the pan. That's what this is. David's anger is brief, but it's big for a moment. David blows his top when he hears this. But it's interesting, the whole situation, because we've been going through all of 2 Samuel. And so we have the context here. David's instinctive response, as would be any father's instinctive response, is anger and heartbreak. That his firstborn could commit such a flagrant and disgusting act. Amnon had blatantly disobeyed the law of God. Leviticus 18 records all of the different relationships that are restricted. They're forbidden under God's law. This relationship was without question. It was out of line. It was inappropriate. It expressly forbids this incestuous relationship. Not only did the law forbid this type of relationship, but it also lays out the punishment. If you were to go to Leviticus 18, and we won't for sake of time, but if you were to go there, you could read the punishment that is laid out for those who engage in this sin. Under the law of Moses, in most cases, rape was a capital offense. The solution, the punishment, the consequence for engaging in this disgusting, lewd act was death. You would be put to death without a whole lot of question and probably without a whole lot of pity. In other instances, I said in most cases, the consequence was death. In other cases, there were some instances where a fine could be paid and the person who had been taken would be married. But in all cases, shame, deep, abiding, unending shame would follow that person to their grave, whether they reached it at the hands of the state executioner or whether they reached it later in life. Their whole life would be under the shadow of this disgusting sin. But you see, right there in your copy of God's Word, you see the extent of David's dealings. We read nothing of David handing down consequence to Amnon for his wicked actions. You can go to other parallel passages. You can look in Chronicles. You find no instance where David does anything. He gets mad. He's a flash in the pan of anger, but nothing more. Why? Why would David not do something? Well, let me make a case to you here. Given what we know, and given the fact that we've covered chapter 11, chapter 12, and now into chapter 13, I would make the case to you that by David indulging his own lust with Bathsheba, it would seem hypocritical for him to make a big deal about his son's actions. David committed adultery. David committed murder on a vast scale. And so now he's got a son who's engaging in this. It's kind of a forgotten consequence of sin, but there's a loss of moral high ground. When you and I compromise, it places us at a disadvantage. And David finds himself at a very distinct disadvantage. Let me give you a passage from Romans. This very well encapsulates it. Romans 2, verse 21, the Apostle Paul says, "Thou therefore which teachest another, Teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? That's what David did. For David to come and say, Amnon, what in the world, son? How could you do this? What could Amnon say? He could look at his father, and it would be disrespectful, but he could look at his father and say, Dad, you did it. You're in no position to talk to me about my morals. And you know what? He'd be right, wouldn't he? David, in David's sacrificing and compromising himself, he put himself at a disadvantage when it came to dealing with others. Paul goes on, he says, Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? I would imagine Paul might have even thought of David as he was writing this. Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law, dishonorest thou God? David, bringing legitimate consequences and punishment upon Amnon for his sin, was compromised by David's own recent moral failure. And we don't think about that as a consequence of our sin, do we? We think of the consequence of our sin, well, it hurt this person. In David's case, it hurt Bathsheba. It killed her husband. It damaged her family. It damaged his family. And it gave occasion for the enemies of God to blaspheme. But we didn't even think about this. David compromised himself so that he was on shaky ground when he had to deal with others who were in mortal sin, like his children. And as we'll see, will be the case again. Moving forward, as we go forward through the book of 2 Samuel, we're going to see that David does not correct his sons consistently. David very rarely corrects his sons at all. This is going to lead to heartache down the road, incidentally. You remember way back in 1 Samuel, you remember the high priest in Shiloh, his name was Eli. And Eli had two sons who he let run crazy. He let them do their own thing. He didn't correct them. As a result of that, Eli lost the priesthood. Eli, he was kind of replaced, if you want to say it that way, by a young man named Samuel. Samuel also had two sons. Do you remember what kind of a father was Samuel? Do you remember? Not a good one. He let his sons do whatever they wanted. They had no consequences, and as a result, Samuel's ministry suffered. And here we have David also allowing his sons to raise themselves, to just act without consequence. It's going to lead to heartache. Let me share with you some of the verses that I disliked most as a child. Proverbs 13:24, He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. What does that mean? Well, we would shorten this to another proverb that says, spare the rod and spoil the child. Is that true? Did you like this verse as a child? It was never one of my favorites. I heard it a lot. Okay? This is true. And it works later, too. You say, well, Amnon's a little bit old for David to put him over his knee. Hey, let's just call the rod correction. He that doesn't correct his son hates him. Proverbs 29:15, the rod and reproof. Just speaking into the process. Hey, son, you're out of line. Son, you're going off the rails here. He says, the rod and reproof give wisdom. But a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. In this case, not just his mother, brings his father and his whole family to shame. David got angry, but once his anger had flared up and then subsided, the issue was swept under the rug and seemingly forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten because Absalom's hatred was alive and well, verse 22. And Absalom spake unto his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad. For Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. Life kind of went back to normal for most of the people in Jerusalem. Everybody, that is, except Absalom. Absalom was not close to being done with this. Amnon interestingly here, Amnon hates Tamar, right? Because after he had committed his act, he hated her. The Bible says that the hatred that he hated her with was greater than the love that he loved her with. So Amnon hates Tamar. Absalom hates Amnon. This is not a healthy family dynamic here. Absalom is not creating a scene, though. He's not venting about this. He's not going and yelling at Amnon. Rather, he's silently plotting. You could say he's kind of simmering and awaiting the opportunity to exact revenge. I would make the case to you that if we think of it as a whole, Absalom's rage was likely also fueled by David's refusal to deal with the issue. You think? If David would have stepped up and brought about the just and righteous consequences that God declares, then Absalom's issue would have truly gone away. But it didn't, because David shirked his responsibility because David had compromised himself. In the eyes of Absalom, Amnon had committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable and gotten off truly without even a slap on the wrist. And so Absalom devises a plot. Verse 23, and it came to pass after 2 full years. That's a long time. That's a long time to sit and simmer, but Absalom does. And it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal-Hazor, which is beside Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. If you remember back in 1 Samuel 25 with Nabal and Abigail, sheep shearing was a big deal. Think of it as the old threshers of the day. Okay, they get together in Baal-Hazor, and it's a big time. Everybody comes together and they shear all of the flocks together, and then they're able to take all of the wool and take it off to market and do what they need to with it. Time for a big celebration, a festival. Baal-Hazor. Let me give you a little bit of where this is. Right here, the bottom red dot is Jerusalem, and if you go straight north and just a little bit east, you come to Baal-Hazor. It would be called just Hazor. You can take the Baal off today. It's still a city that's there, and you can go see it. Hazor is a tribal territory. It's 12 miles north of Jerusalem. And Absalom invites his brothers and then widens the invitation, verse 24. And Absalom came to the king and said, Behold now, thy servant hath sheep shearers. Let the king, I beseech thee, and his servants go with thy servant. In other words, Dad, why don't you come? I've invited everybody. I want you to be there too. Absalom was fairly safe in assuming that the king would decline this invitation. But by inviting David, he took away the suspicion. He removed the suspicion of his motives. Because in David's mind, well, he wouldn't have, if he was planning on doing something nefarious, he wouldn't have invited me. Verse 25. And the king said to Absalom, Nay, my son, let us not all go now, lest we be chargeable unto thee. And he pressed him, howbeit he would not go, but blessed him. David declines by saying he does not want to be chargeable to Absalom. That word could be burdensome. We don't want to be a burden to you, but it could also be we don't want to take the glory. What happens if, let's say, you have a big birthday party and you invite the governor, okay, and the governor comes to your birthday party? Who are people going to be more excited to see at your birthday party? Depends on who your friends are, right? But everybody wants to see the governor, right? It's a novelty. Well, that's what David's saying to Absalom. He says, look, son, I'm not going to come. If I come to your festival, then I'm going to be the one in the spotlight. I don't want that. Just don't worry about it. But David blesses him, it says. He says, he would not go, but he blessed him. Son, I hope it's a great party. I'm just not coming. I don't want to steal the spotlight. Verse 26. Then said Absalom, If not, I pray thee, let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said unto him, Why should he go with thee? I see suspicion here. It looks like something in David's spirit was a check. If David can't come, would he please send Amnon? Remember, Amnon is the heir apparent. We would refer to him as the crown prince. He's the guy who, if all goes according to plan, when David steps off, Amnon will step in. And so Absalom says to David, look, if you can't come, send Amnon, the heir apparent, to come in your place. But David's no fool. He seems suspicious. Why should he go with thee? David hasn't forgotten what happened 2 years prior. But perhaps David, I think probably, we want to assume the best, especially about our children. David wants to believe, I think, that Absalom is trying to move on. Maybe Absalom is finally ready to bury the hatchet in this matter, and we'll just move on. It was unfortunate, it was nasty, but hopefully now we can move on and we can have peace in this family again. I think that's what David was pulling for. David, it seems, was at first not going to let Absalom go, but verse 27, but Absalom pressed him that he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. David sets his suspicions aside, gives Absalom the benefit of the doubt, and allows all of his sons, including Amnon. Maybe he thinks this will be a unifying time for them. They'll get together like brothers do. They'll be able to just move past this. Finally, we'll have some unity. But revenge is what Absalom has in mind. Verse 28, Now Absalom had commanded his servant, saying, Mark ye now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine. And when I say unto you, Smite Amnon, then kill him. Fear not, have not I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. The servants of Absalom did unto Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, every man got him up upon his mule and fled. Absalom does not actually hold the sword that kills Amnon. Just like, where did he learn to use somebody else to kill the enemy? Where could he possibly have gotten that idea? Dad. David. You remember David used the sword of the Ammonites to kill Uriah. And now Absalom's following in his footsteps. When Amnon is drunk, Absalom has a prearranged sign with his servants for them to murder his brother. The speech that he gives there, in verse 28, read over it, and it's interesting. It sounds familiar a little bit. He says, Smite Amnon, then kill him. Okay, so that's break the fifth commandment is the first part. But then, this portion right here, very interesting. He says, Fear not, have not I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. Does that sound familiar to you at all? Does that sound anything like what God told Joshua when Joshua was going into the land? Again, Absalom is a master manipulator. In Joshua 1 verse 9 we read, this is God speaking to Joshua. He says, Have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. Now Absalom doesn't say, hey, God told you to do this, but Absalom does say, hey, I commanded you, be strong, be valiant, be courageous. A master manipulator who gets people through his words to do exactly what he wants. This is going to be a trait that will come up in Absalom again. Absalom convinces his servants that it is courageous and valiant to kill a drunken man. That's how twisted it is. Well, the servants obey Absalom's order. Amnon is murdered in cold blood, and the rest of the king's sons scattered. It says, Then all the king's sons arose, and every man got up upon his mule and fled. Mules were the chosen means of transportation for the royal family, and that's not just here. That happens, if you look in the book of Judges, you'll find that very regularly, that people of high rank rode around on mules. This is the case. They get up, they scatter in all directions, it seems, causing panic in Jerusalem. It's only 12 miles from Baal Hazor down to Jerusalem. It says, and it came to pass while they were in the way that tidings came to David, meaning the sons had not gotten to Jerusalem. Somebody riding something faster than a mule went from Baal Hazor down to Jerusalem, and they came with all the wrong information. That tidings came to David, middle of verse 30, saying, Absalom hath slain all the king's sons, and there is not one of them left. David is crushed. Imagine what's going through his mind. He knows of the turmoil, but now all of my sons are gone. I showed you that chart earlier. Did you see how many sons he had? All of my sons are dead. Verse 31, then the king arose and tare his garments. Again, the ultimate sign of grief. Lay upon the earth, and all his servants stood by with their clothes rent. Immediately upon receiving this news, David and his whole household descend into weeping and mourning. But somebody speaks up. From off to the side, somebody walks up and starts talking. Look at verse 32. And Jonadab, the son of Shimei, David's brother, answered and said, Let not my lord suppose that they have slain all the young men, the king's sons. For Amnon only is dead. For by the appointment of Absalom this hath been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart to think that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon only is dead. Well, how on earth did he know that? Well, he knew because he was involved. You see, the last time we saw Jonadab was in verse 3. Back when we heard that, but Amnon had a friend, Jonadab was the friend who came along and told Amnon, hey, let me tell you how to work this out. What we come to find out here is that Jonadab was working both sides of this equation. He was involved in getting Amnon to rape Tamar, and he's involved in Absalom's plot to avenge that wrong. Amnon immediately allays David's worst fears. Absalom hasn't killed all of your sons, just Amnon. He knew what was going on. Again, leading us to suspect that Jonadab and Absalom, this kind of puts some light on the fact that when Absalom walked up to Tamar, he said, it was Amnon, wasn't it? Kind of like they were working together the whole time. They've been working from the beginning to remove Amnon as the heir apparent, because Amnon's he's the crown prince. He's the one, if David's gone, Amnon gets the throne. And now that Amnon's gone, guess who gets the throne? Absalom. Interesting, isn't it? The punishment for rape, as prescribed by the law, was death. Amnon is dead, murdered by Absalom. Interesting. Verse 34. But Absalom fled. Now, we'll talk about that more when we get to verse 37, but just continue on. And the young man that kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there came much people by the way of the hill beside him. All David has at this point is Jonadab's word that his sons, with the exception of Amnon, are alive. And the watchman of the city is standing there, and he's looking towards the north to see as messengers will come, and then as the king's sons begin to arrive. Verse 35. And Jonadab said unto the king, Behold, the king's sons come. As thy servant said, so it is. And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of speaking, that behold, the king's sons came, lifted up their voice and wept, and the king also and all his servants wept very sore. Interestingly, this is the last mention that we have of Jonadab. We don't ever hear from Jonadab again after this. So David is now, he has this news. Imagine the roller coaster of emotions. David, all your kids are dead. Oh, no. David, just one of your kids is dead. Would you say it's good news? Better news, but it's still terrible. David is a broken man here. He falls down again in weeping, and all of his servants, as the king's sons come in and explain what happened. Meanwhile, Absalom flees. Verse 37, but Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. Here's why I told you it's significant earlier who Absalom's mother was. Absalom is the son of David through Maacah. Maacah is the daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur. David runs to his grandfather's house by his mother. Did I say David? Absalom. Absalom runs to his grandfather's house on his mother's side. The law of Moses, I already said, the law regarding rape, what's the consequence according to the law? Death. This one's easier. What's the punishment for murder under the law of God? Also death. Okay? It's capital offense. In Absalom's case, even the cities of refuge, which were scattered about throughout Israel, were not open to a premeditated murderer. When you come in and you've committed premeditated murder, they'll kick you out of the city of refuge and allow the avenger of blood to kill you. Absalom's only perceived hope is to get out of the country. He flees Israel and leaves and goes to Geshur. The unexpected part of this verse is the last phrase there of verse 37. And David mourned for his son every day. Now I looked into this and I tried to figure it out. My question, which son? Which son did he mourn? Well, David mourns the death of Amnon, but David is also mourning the loss of Absalom. Every day, David wakes up and he desires to have fellowship with Absalom. Verse 38. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. Over the course of 3 years, David's mourning subsides. Amnon's loss, maybe David sees in it some sort of a poetic justice. A consequence was imposed upon his son that he had not been able to impose. David even considered going to Geshur, we see here. He longed to go forth unto Absalom. The law dictated that David should have brought Absalom home. When he got Absalom home, he should have had his son executed for the crime of murdering his other son. But once again, what does David do? Nothing. He just sidesteps. David sidesteps the issue, has no dealings with his son. He wants to, but he doesn't. And that's where we leave off here in chapter 13. We've got Absalom in the north, in Geshur. Amnon is dead. Tamar, perhaps Absalom took her with him. We don't have it recorded. There's a lot of application that can be made from this whole account. Once again, when we talk about Jonadab, there's a warning. Be careful who your friends are. Jonadab was a corrupting influence on Amnon, and it would also appear on Absalom. At the same time, he was working both ends against the middle, causing a mess. But it's also, and I think probably the main application that we can take from this, David has shown that one of the forgotten consequences of sin is a loss of personal credibility in dealing with the sins of others. When I sin, particularly as David did in a public manner, it places my ability to speak to others, it's suspect. David's own sin, though forgiven by God, seemed to block him from being willing or effectively capable of dealing with the sins of his sons. He just continually overlooked it. He was angry, he was brokenhearted, but he didn't deal with it God's way. What should David have done? What would have been the ideal? If we could go back to 2 Samuel 11, and we could go to David after he has committed the sin with Bathsheba, what should we counsel King David to do? I would counsel King David to bring his sons in. He's got adult children, Absalom, Amnon, and others as well. He should have sat his sons down and he should have explained the horrendous and permanent scars left by his sinful choices. David should have sat down, he should have said, boys, listen to me. I made bad choices and I'm dealing with the consequences of them. You learned the lesson that I have taken the knocks for. I've gone through the school of hard knocks so you don't have to benefit from my experience. But rather than correct and instruct his sons, David allowed them to get away with murder, literally. And the seeds of destruction sown in chapter 11 continue to bear fruit. It's interesting, though, isn't it? I read to you some verses from Proverbs. Who wrote Proverbs? Solomon. And Solomon was what relation to David? His son. Interesting, isn't it? That the son of the man who shirked his responsibility as a father spoke up as he did. David wrote in Psalm 51, following his sin with Bathsheba. This is his penitential psalm when he's lamenting, he's confessing his sin. He says, in the latter part of the chapter, he says, restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. Then will I teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. What should David have done? He should have stepped up and shared his experience, his bad experience, with his sons. Boys, learn from my mistakes. Learn from the steps that I've taken outside of the will of God. God has given me the chastening. Hear what God has done for me. You don't need to make the same mistakes. But he didn't. Rather, we have in David, once again, an example of how not to do it. Kind of interesting, though, that he's still a man after God's own heart. Because in spite of all of this, in spite of what I would kind of dub it as a little bit of cowardice, perhaps, that he didn't stand up and correct his sons, in spite of all of this, David's heart truly did long for the Lord. David truly did have a heart for God. Though misled, though sometimes he did the wrong thing, his heart was certainly the Lord's possession. Any thoughts that you have, or questions that you have from 2 Samuel 13 that we've looked at tonight?
My question is that Samuel told him that, I think it was Samuel, or Nathan, told him that the sword would never leave his house. So he basically just threw his arms up in the air and say, well, this is going to happen to me because of my sin. All these things are going to happen. That's my question.
It could be. It could be, and we have instances of that exact attitude from other kings. If you remember, godly King Hezekiah, I was just reading this past week in Isaiah. Godly King Hezekiah, he showed off all of his wealth to the Babylonians who came. And the prophet Isaiah goes and he said, who did you show all of this to? He said, I showed them everything. Man, they saw it all. And Isaiah told godly King Hezekiah, he said, because of what you've done, one day the Babylonians are going to have everything that you showed them. They're going to take your sons and mutilate them, and they will be in the service of the kings of Babylon. And Hezekiah, godly King Hezekiah, said, it's a good thing because there's going to be peace in my day. how could you have that perspective as a parent? I look at the issues. I think, well, you know what? If I have to fight so my children can live in peace, so be it. But it is possible that David kind of took the fatalistic approach of, well, what's going to happen is going to happen, and there's nothing I can do. What should he have done? Again, he should have said, look, if this is going to happen, it's going to happen in spite of my prayers, in spite of my teaching, in spite of my trying to get my sons to love Jehovah the way I love him. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen in spite of me, not because I just threw up my hands. But it is entirely possible that he did. Yeah? Any other thoughts? Good observation. Read ahead. Read ahead, because next week, Lord willing, David's going to bring Absalom home. And he's going to take counsel from a man who we wouldn't suggest taking counsel from. His name's Joab. And what we know of Joab would make us think, anything he says should be highly suspect. But we'll see that God can use even the most unlikely of sources next week. Read ahead. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, once again, we thank you for the privilege of looking at these men and women in the Old Testament and seeing the examples. Lord, we know that David's sons didn't learn from his experience. Perhaps because he didn't tell them, perhaps because they were stubborn. Lord, I pray that as we have it recorded, that we would learn from David's experience. That we would be dedicated, that we would be so focused on you. And Lord, even when we do sin, Lord, that we would confess, forsake, seek restoration, and then warn others so that they can avoid the same issues. Lord, we love you. We thank you for the privilege that it is to gather together. I pray you'd be with us as we go our separate ways. I pray you'd keep us safe, healthy, bring us back at the next appointed time. In Jesus' name.